Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is Shafiq Ahmed, lecturer, Department of Accounting, Banking and Finance, Sindh Madrasatul Islam, University Karachi. I welcome you all in today's session. Today's session is about the data collection in qualitative research. And for that purpose, we have our distinguished guest, Dr. Ghazal Shaikh. Dr. Ghazal Shaikh is currently working as an assistant professor at Institute of English Language and Literature, University of Sindh Jamshoro. She had pursued her PhD from University of York in English in Education. Her research interests are educating or teaching in fiction, teaching citizenship, and teaching citizenship through literature. She has publication in renowned journals like Cambridge Journal of Education, Women's Studies International Forum, and Asian Journal of Social Sciences. Now, without taking much time, I would like to hand over the session to Dr. Ghazal Shaikh. And at the end of session, we can take the question from the audience. So it's over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shafiq. Good evening, everybody. I would like to start the session with my PowerPoint. Let me just share my slides. All right. Today's session is about data collection in qualitative research. We're going to talk about the research process, research questions, data collection in qualitative research, interviews, sampling, observation, reliability, and validity in qualitative research. So these are the topics that I'm hoping to cover today. I hope that many of you are already familiar with some of these topics, and we'll briefly touch on the first two. So starting with the research process, we always start a research with a problem. You've got to have an issue, a kind of a conflict in academic literature. Maybe there is a debate that you want to pursue. Maybe there is something that you've observed in society that you want to look into more detail of. So we start with a research problem, then we move on to the literature review. Once you have a problem, once you are sure that this is the area that you want to explore more about, we try and look into more details of what other people have done regarding it. So once we look into the literature, we are able to come up with a more specific topic, more specific inquiry, which obviously leads us to our research question. Research questions would help you determine the course of your study. Your whole study would be guided by that one or two questions that you would design at that stage. Sometimes our research questions are guided by a theory or a hypothesis. Hypotheses are more common in quantitative research, which is not something that we'll be talking about today. Our research questions lead us towards our research design. So we have to decide at this stage whether we are going to do a qualitative research, a quantitative research, whether we are going to do a mixed methods design. So however your research questions are structured will also help determine the research design of your study. Research design. After you have designed your research, you will start your data collection. Data collection is done through a number of methods. Today, we are going to talk about this step in particular in more detail. Obviously, after you've collected your data, you're going to analyze it, and which would then lead towards your report. At the end, it will lead towards the writing of your report, whether it's an article, whether it's a thesis, whatever you write, that's what I'm calling the report. So this is the complete research process. This is something that hopefully you will be doing in a research study. Moving on, research questions. So as we all know, hopefully, that a research question is a question that guides a research study and is based on a research problem and literature review. So it needs to be based on both of these things. As you saw in the research process, it came after the problem and literature review. So it's the third thing in the research process, the third step on the queue. Now, I really like Alan Bryman's book on social research methods. He gives a very detailed criteria of formulating research questions. Um, he also tells us how research questions can be designed, what are the factors that could affect the design of research questions. So it's a very good reading if you're interested in getting into more detail of. But what I wanted to point out was this criteria. So there are these 6 bullet points on the screen. Hopefully you can see them. It needs to be clear, researchable. It needs to be connected with established theory and research. If it's more than one questions, then they need to be linked to each other. And it should be a question that can make an original contribution, not something that is already established. And it should neither be too broad of a focus or not too narrow. So it should be adequate for the level of research that you're doing. For example, for an undergraduate study, if I was dealing with students of literature, then selecting one novel is enough. But for a PhD, they would have to select 4 novels. So it depends on the level that you are working at. I've got some examples on the screen as well. What are the factors that motivate teachers in selected private sector schools to teach English? How does reading fiction as part of their curriculum help undergraduate students at a public sector university in Pakistan learn English? So if you look at the questions closely, you would see that they are very specific. Now, why am I talking about research questions in a data collection webinar? Because your research question will help determine whether it's qualitative or quantitative research. So a research question reflects whether the study will be qualitative or quantitative, as I just said. It will be qualitative if you're looking for understanding a few people in detail. So in qualitative research, we don't have a very big sample. We don't have a very big data set, but we have a small number of people, if it's people that you're researching, or a small number of observation sites, but the data is in depth. So if your question reflects something like that, then you would choose qualitative research. If you're interested in how different factors affect each other or how much frequency of things, then obviously you need to go into quantitative research. In qualitative research, we can use a number of tools to collect data. Observations, questionnaires, and interviews can be used in qualitative research. However, observations are also used in quantitative research. So it's not about the tool, rather it's about the kind of data that has been gathered through that tool. So if it's a very structured observation, then obviously it will be analyzed quantitatively. If it's a questionnaire with closed-ended questions, then it will be analyzed quantitatively. The one with open-ended questions will be analyzed qualitatively. Interviews are mostly used in qualitative research. However, structured interviews can sometimes be analyzed quantitatively as well. Due to the limitations of time and due to the similarity of the tools, I will focus on interviews and observations today. Designing an open-ended questionnaire is, however, comparable in many ways to an interview schedule. I have a few questions for the audience here. Shafiq, would it be possible to look at the comments of the audience and answers to these questions? Shafiq, would it be possible for us to look at the comments of our audience? I can't hear you. You would have to unmute your mic.
I haven't received any comment yet. I will show
all right.
once.
Okay, that's fine. Right. So my question is whether it's quantitative or qualitative. So the first one, What are consumers' perceptions regarding the effectiveness of the newly introduced product? Any product. I couldn't think of a name of a product at that point. But if this was your research question, do you think this is a qualitative study or a quantitative one? This since it's a study of perceptions, it would have to be qualitative. Let's go on. How about this one? How does witnessing domestic violence impact a child's relationship in adulthood? Being from education myself and from the field of literature, I have tried to design questions that are relevant to everybody, to the whole audience here. So I hope this is okay for those who actually belong to those fields. We've got some responses, Shafiq, in the comments on Facebook. How about the second one? Musab and Musab has replied qualitative. Do we have any other responses for the second one? It'll be really useful if you could put a 2 and then respond, because I'm not sure which question you're responding to, whether the first one or the second one. Perception is purely qualitative. Abdul Jabbar, that's right. How about this one? Factors. Nobody is writing quantitative. Purab has written quantitative. Okay. All right. Since it's the impact of one factor on the other, witnessing domestic violence is one factor and it affects child's relationship. This would be done quantitatively. Okay. The next one, how does income inequality affect ambivalence in a high density urban areas? How about this one? Do we have any answers? Yes, Pira, that's right. This could be quantitative. How about the last one? Question 1 and 2 both are Irfan, I think the first is qualitative and the second one is quantitative. Somebody says this can be mixed. Okay, yeah, that's an acceptable answer. It's not the researcher who's going to witness, it's about how the child has witnessed. Abdul Jabbar, I'm answering your, okay. All right, the third one is quantitative as well because it's about one factor affecting the other. All right, let's move on. Interviews. So I'm going to now start talking about collecting data through interviews. What is an interview? Cohen, Minion, and Morris in 2007 described the interview as a flexible tool for data collection that enables multisensory channels to be used, verbal, non-verbal, spoken, and heard. When they're saying that it's a multisensory channel, they mean that it's not just about being spoken and being heard, but also about looking at the gestures, expressions, body language of the respondent. So an interviewer in some ways observes the respondent as well and make notes of whatever their body language and expressions and gestures are saying as well. So sometimes people answer something with a smirk, with a slight smile on their face. Sometimes people answer something with a frown. So that also says something about the data, that adds to the data. So it's a multisensory channel. You can actually observe the person that you are taking the interview from. An interview is different from a simple conversation because the purpose is to collect specific information, which is your data. In an interview, we are always trying to gather information regarding our research questions. So we have a specific guideline of what kind of questions or areas we need to cover and what kind of information we need from the audience, from the respondent. So it is very different from a simple conversation. When do we use interviews? We use interviews when facts are not enough, when it is impossible directly to observe what we are interested in, when we are interested in finding out people's views, opinions, perceptions, feelings. We want to get details and explanations and stories and accounts. So whenever we are interested in the why question, whenever we are interested in depth of things, that's when we use interviews. Okay? When we are not able to observe those things that we are interested in, people's views cannot be observed, right? So views and perceptions are often taken through interviews. Types of research interviews, there are many ways of defining types. Sometimes types are based on mode of communication. Sometimes types are based on organization and structure. So these are some types. Focus groups. Focus groups are interviews with a group of people together. Focus group interviews are done, for example, when you're dealing with younger children. It's especially with vulnerable groups, any form of vulnerable groups, because if they're in a group, they will speak more comfortably, right? Example could be interview with a group of pupils on cheating. So if you talk to somebody one-to-one, they might not be as open about cheating in exams as they might be with a group of friends. Life history interviews, often called life story interviews as well. These could be, for example, an interview with older people about their school days. So you want to know about their whole life. You want to, you're interested in the whole history of that one person. That could be a way of doing interviews, often used in ethnographic research. Increasingly common, especially in COVID times, telephone or internet interviews. Interviewing a student in Hong Kong while studying in the UK. You could be doing that through your devices. And these days, we're all, most researchers are going for telephonic or internet interviews as well. Zoom is a pretty good device for doing that. It helps you save audio and video, both of them. So it can be really good tool for collecting data in these times. If I was to talk about interview types according to structure, then we have three different types: structured, semi-structured, and unstructured interviews. Structured interviews are those which are very organized, very formal, and you have a strict interview schedule. Interview schedule is the list of questions that we prepare before taking the interview, and I will talk about how we need to prepare that. It is often called an interview schedule, an interview protocol, or sometimes even an interview guide. It's in a structured interview. It's almost like a questionnaire survey, right? It's almost like you're taking a survey and you have a list of questions and you're asking people that and you're ticking the answer. Sometimes the questions are closed-ended as well, and sometimes they're open-ended. In case of a structured, closed-ended interview, it will be analyzed quantitatively. However, if it's a structured interview but open-ended questions, then it will be analyzed qualitatively. Okay. It's often used in market research, government surveys. You know, when you go to a supermarket and there are people standing there with a lot of papers and they're asking you questions and they quickly tick the answers. That's like a structured interview. In those situations, why do we do structured interviews and not questionnaires? Sometimes it's not easy to collect the questionnaire back from the people. The same situation, if you're in a supermarket, if they gave you a questionnaire, a paper, and asked you to give it back to them after taking it, you would probably disappear and not give it back to them. So in that situation, a structured interview is much more effective and convenient than a questionnaire. Okay. Moving on, semi-structured interviews. Semi-structured interviews are a little bit more flexible than structured interviews. We have a list of questions prepared here as well. It's organized, but it allows room to ask follow-up questions. So it's not necessary that you should stick completely to those list of questions. You can move a little bit here and there. Very common in social sciences, in education, in sociology, in business. They're very common in all social sciences. Okay, and they're preferable because, especially for new researchers, because if you have a list of questions, you feel very prepared, you feel very confident, and you're able to ask those questions from the respondent. You're able to ask follow-up questions like why, how, could you explain that, use certain probes, so you can get in-depth data through the interviews. Okay. The next one is unstructured interviews. Unstructured interviews are, as the name indicates, unstructured, not very well organized. Instead of having a list of questions, people who do unstructured interviews, they have a list of broad areas that they want to cover. So I want to know about this person's education, family background, reasons for choosing the literature as their field. I have these 3 areas and I don't have specific questions. So it can go on in any order. It's very flexible and informal, almost like a conversation. It's used in ethnographic and anthropological research. Ethnographic researchers often use unstructured interviews because they tend to investigate in natural settings of people, and they don't want to make it too formal because that takes people away from their natural setting and they might respond in a way that's different from their regular conversations. I hope that that's clear to everybody. If there are any questions, you could write them in the chat and I can hopefully read them. If an interviewee agrees to be interviewed but not being honest because he doesn't want to seem vulnerable, we will talk about that. We will talk about social desirability effect and Hawthorne effect. Sapna, you can ask this question again if it's still not answered at the end. Okay. All right, moving on. Strengths and weaknesses of interviews. Strengths, we get rich data, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's more valid. Okay. Sometimes, like we were just talking about, the social desirability effect, the bias of the researcher, the bias that the presence of the researcher creates in the responses of the respondents, that can affect the validity of our data. We will talk about that in a bit. But it does give us very rich data. Another positive of interviews is that they can give us the unexpected data. How unexpected data? Say, for example, if you're asking unbiased, neutral questions, you might have certain expectations in your mind that people will answer in this way, but then they might not. They might answer completely differently. When I was doing my PhD study, it was on teaching citizenship through fiction, and I thought our students would have no idea about civic and political rights and duties. I had this perception that with relation, our literature students are not that into these things, and they might not have understood these things in the novels. However, the unexpected data was that they were pretty familiar with those concepts, and they could actually see those themes in the political novels being taught. That's a strength of the interviews. You can always get unexpected data. It's good for answering the why question. It helps you understand the context. So in questionnaires, it's just small snippets, right? It's very little bits written on a piece of paper. People don't write much. Speaking is much easier. And then in an interview, you are present there to ask further questions, especially in qualitative interviews. In semi-structured and unstructured interviews, you can ask follow-up questions and they can answer and respond to that. So you can understand the whole context of the situation very easily. Moving on to the weaknesses, reliability, interviewer bias. There can be that bias by the presence of the interviewer, and if the respondent knows your topic, they might want to reply in that way. So in order to remove that, we try our level best to not ask value-laden questions. We try not to give too much of the topic at the beginning and stuff like that. But obviously, the presence of this person, this researcher, affects the way that the respondent responds, and that's one of the weaknesses of interviews. Qualitative research is never generalizable, so you cannot claim after taking interviews from 10 students of a class that the whole class said this or this class believes this. So you have to consider this in all qualitative research. It's not generalizable. And there is going to be instances of non-response. So you're going to ask people to, based on a certain criteria, you might select them, but then there are going to be people from that list who are not going to respond to you, and you would have to take the interview from somebody else. Then there is the selection bias. You might select certain people who you were close to you or who you were able to contact more easily. And interviews are very time consuming, much more time consuming than a questionnaire. However, as compared to observation, they may be less time consuming. All right, so we have questions here. Interviews or not. Number one, students' views on learning identity through a selected novel. Just give me a moment. Please write number 1, 2, or 3 in your comments so I can see which one you're answering to. The first one, is it an interview or not? Students' views on learning identity through a selected novel. Yes, Tanya says yes. Any other responses? Tanzila, please keep your question and I'll try and answer it at the end. Wafa says yes. All right, let's move on. That's correct. The students' views, since we are looking at views on learning identity through a novel, it's obviously something that we would do through interviews. How about the second one? Teachers' use of communicative teaching techniques while teaching English as a second language. Can we do interviews for that? Mafaz is not sure, maybe. Okay, how about others? 1 and 2, yes. Sameem. Nasib says 1, yes. Okay, so for the second one, teachers' use of communicative teaching techniques while teaching English as a second language, I feel that observation is a more suitable instrument here. We can observe this better. If we attend the classes and observe, it would be much better than doing an interview. The third one, a study investigating the relationship between family size and children's educational achievement. That's a quantitative research. Can be done through an experimental design, maybe? I'm not an expert at quantitative, but you don't do interviews there, okay? No interviews. Moving on, sampling. Okay. Now, what is sampling? Sampling is the selection of the participants from a large population, right? So if you're collecting data, if your topic is, let's think of a topic. If your topic is access to education, girls' access to education at primary schools in Sindh, your population would be all the girls in all the primary schools in Sindh, right? However, you would select a few girls from it to interview, right? Those selected few would be your sample. So sampling or selecting of participants from a large population is a task that should be done very thoughtfully. You should think about all the different things that might affect your choice, and removing your own bias from the selection procedure is very essential. So there are various kinds of sampling broadly under probability and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling is more methodical and is followed in quantitative research designs. That's not something that we would be talking about in detail because it's quantitative. However, non-probability samplings are the ones that are used in qualitative research, and that's something which has various other kinds that we will be talking about today. Okay. I have seen some of our MS students saying probability sampling for a qualitative research. So please do remember that whenever we are doing qualitative research, we are doing non-probability sampling techniques. Okay. Factors to consider when sampling. Cohen and colleagues in 2012 edition of the book, they have suggested 4 factors to consider that, when taking sampling decisions in qualitative research. You need to think about size. So how many are you going to take views from? Say, for example, if you're looking at people's perceptions, there is this concept of saturation point. When you start to get the same views and nothing different is coming up in your data, that's where it's considered a saturation point, and that's where it's suggested to stop. In qualitative research, the numbers are smaller as compared to quantitative, much, much smaller. And you need to think about your ability to analyze that data as well. Okay, so the limitations of time and time and resources need to be considered when deciding how many participants you need. For example, in my PhD study, I had 26 participants, and with each participant, I did 1 to 1.5 hour interview. However, another colleague that I know of did a PhD with only 6 participants, and she had each participant's interview lasted over 3 to 4 hours. So it depends on your research question and the kind of your study as well. Now, representativeness is, it's not the same way that it would be representative in quantitative research, but we need to consider the factors that affect our sample and our population. For example, if you want people's perceptions in a certain classroom, you might want to select different groups within the class. So there might be boys and girls within the class. There might be people from government schools and private schools that you think would affect their perceptions. You might have people from urban background and rural background. You might have people from honors side and master's side, things like that, which you think might affect their perceptions. So you will select a sample that to some extent represents those different groups within your population. Obviously, you need to consider access. So who exactly do you have access to? You're not going to say that you're not going to be able to contact people that are representative if you do not have any access to them. So you need to think about who you can easily contact and find access to. That's something that should be considered. And the sampling strategy. So what kind of sampling strategy are you going to use? We're going to talk about those sampling strategies on the next slide. We have three different kinds, three more common kinds of non-probability sampling. The first one is purposive sampling. Purposive sampling is the sampling strategy where the sample is selected based on the characteristics of the population and the objective of the study. So you have the purpose in mind, you know that this is my purpose, and based on these factors, I'm going to select my population. For example, in my one of my research, I did purposive sampling. So I wanted participants who belonged to a certain age group. I wanted participants who belonged to a certain religious group, a certain linguistic group, and they had to be a mix of both male and female. So I had these 4 factors that I felt affected my population, and I did it purposively. Another kind of sampling technique is a snowball sampling. Researchers identify a small number of individuals who have characteristics in which they are interested, and then they ask those respondents to tell them of other people. So it's like a snowball. It goes on down the hill collecting more snow. So it one person leads you to another person, that person leads you to another person. That's snowball sampling. Convenience sampling, also sometimes called accidental or opportunity sampling, involves choosing the nearest individuals to serve as respondents and continuing that process until the required sample has been obtained. Okay, so practical reasons of access are so important that there is one sampling strategy where you do it according to your convenience. So you have access to these people. That is why you're taking data from them. Okay. Moving on. Preparing an interview schedule. Now, when we are preparing an interview schedule in qualitative research, it is a process of trial and error. You have to learn it through practice. Okay. Kalyu and colleagues have tried and given a 5-step process, but when we go through the process, you would see that it's not as methodical or as organized as it might be in quantitative research. So they've given us these 5 steps of how we devise an interview schedule that's more suitable for a semi-structured interview. The first step of the process is identifying the prerequisites of a semi-structured interview. So are you really sure that an interview is what you need for this research? Are you sure that a semi-structured interview is the most appropriate tool here? So you need to consider why you need an interview in this situation. Retrieve and use previous knowledge. So your own understanding of the context and your understanding of your theoretical framework and literature review will help you over here. You need to think about what you know about the context. You need to think about what are the factors that are important in the theory that you're using and in the literature review that you have studied. All those factors need to be considered when designing your questions. So often in our MPhil seminars, the students are asked, how did you come up with this interview schedule? The answer to that question is, through the study of my literature, I came up with these factors. Through the study of my theoretical framework, I came up with these factors. And this led me to formulate these many questions in my interview schedule. Okay? So you should have a clear justification for each question that you put in your interview guide or your interview protocol. Develop an interview schedule in accordance with the knowledge that you had in the second step. Design a list of questions connected with your literature and your research questions. So they cannot be free floating. They're not in a vacuum, right? They need to be connected to your research questions. They need to be connected to your literature review. Pilot the schedule. Now that's very important. People are often asked about the validity and reliability of their research, which we would talk in detail at the end of this session. But piloting is an important step of that process. You need to test the design questions for clarity with at least one participant, okay? You can do more participants in the pilot. You should ideally do more. But if you're just testing the schedule, you can do it with one participant. What are you testing for? You're testing your questions for clarity. You're testing that you are actually getting the data that you wanted through those questions. So they are clear enough. The respondent understands the question, and the data that you're receiving is actually the data that you wanted to get for your research questions. So your research questions are being answered. You need to test that. After testing, you need to readjust your interview schedule. You present a complete semi-structured interview guide after making the necessary adjustments after piloting. Okay, moving on. This is an example of an interview schedule. I'll let you just take a look and go through it. This is one of the schedules that I used in my PhD. There were 3 different kinds of interviews that I did, and this was the one with teachers. I'll take a look at your comments in the meanwhile. Irfan, let's keep your question till the end about the sampling, okay? I'll take it in the question and answer session. All right, moving on. Certain practicalities that you need to think about, okay? Before the interview, consider ethics, okay? In the international context, if you're trying to publish your research in an international journal of good reputation, they would always ask you about ethical considerations. Our universities are beginning to formulate an ethical protocol for different research studies. We do not have one so far in our university, but in many universities, you need to pass an ethics board for the study to be accepted. Okay, so what exactly needs to be done? You need to prepare a consent form. Okay, if whenever you're taking data from human participants, you need to take their consent. What will that consent form have? That consent form will have all the necessary information regarding recording, use of data, anonymity, voluntary participation, and withdrawal. So you're going to assure your participants that they are going to remain anonymous, that it's completely voluntary whether they want to participate or not, and they can withdraw at any stage. You are supposed to allow your participants that. Okay. You're also supposed to tell them what will happen with their recordings and what will happen with their data. How will the data be used? Will it be published somewhere? Will their names come into that paper in research journals? Where exactly you're going to use that data? You need to specify that within the consent form. Give it to them before the interview. Take their permission, hopefully sign it, get them to sign it, and then only you should be doing the interviews. Okay. Another thing that you should be doing is take permission from more participants than you need, as some will drop out. This is a practical reality of the research world. People say they're going to give you an interview, but then they don't. So take permission from more participants, approach more participants than you need, because some of them are going to drop out. You need to pursue them. You need to go to them again and again. You need to remind them that I had taken permission from you. Can I come to you now? Arrange a place and time, keeping their own comfort in mind so that they are able to give you an interview. Somebody is giving you their time. Like, why should they give you their time? So you need to be very considerate about people's time, right? Keep multiple options for recording and prepare to take notes. So have a number of devices, put your phone on flight mode, listen attentively. All those things should be kept in mind. During the interview, listen attentively and talk only when necessary. Your opinion does not matter, okay? You're here to collect data from the participant. Some of us talk a lot, but a research interview is not the time where you are supposed to talk. Be comfortable with silence. Okay. Many of us are not very comfortable with silence. When the other person is quiet, we start talking. Give them time to think about it. You might be asking them certain difficult questions that they've not thought about before. So give them time to think about it. Give them time to answer. But obviously, when you feel that it's been more than a minute and nobody has talked, then you need to give them certain probes. You need to give them certain follow-up questions or explain the question in other words so that they can continue to talk. Take notes of interviewee information, whatever information you need to keep in your own mind to remember this interview. Take note of that information. Sometimes you want to take note of body language and expressions. Do that. Ask neutral, unbiased questions. Don't lead your respondent. Okay, so you should never ask any leading questions. All right. We don't want to say, "Don't you think that large classes are very difficult to teach in?" Obviously, the person is going to say, "Yes, yes, I agree." All right. So don't ask questions which are very leading for the participants. Things to consider: reliability and validity or trustworthiness of data. How do we ensure that our data is reliable and valid? We pilot it, we get the data checked by a peer or supervisor, and we choose our analysis methods carefully. All right. So there is no specific instrument or test to measure the reliability and validity in qualitative research, but we can take certain steps to ensure that our data is trustworthy and dependable. I have a few more comments on that in a later slide. We also need to think about translation issues. Sometimes we, in our context especially, We take data in Sindhi, we take data in Urdu, and then we translate it and report it in English. So it gives rise to a lot of translation issues. You need to think about which language you want to choose before the interview. And since you're collecting data, you're interested in people's opinions, right? You want qualitative data, you want rich data, you want them to answer in detail. So you try and make them as comfortable as possible. And people are often more comfortable in their own language, right? So if you know their mother tongue, try and talk to them in their mother tongue, right? But that raises certain issues regarding translation. You're doing a cross-language research, right? Temple has called it a cross-language research. So it's very important that you make authentic translation-related decisions. And Temple and Young say that you should always give preference to concept rather than lexical equivalence. We don't want the same kind of words. We want that the concept should be the same. And you always need to verify the translation. So ask somebody else who knows both the languages to verify that that you have done it correctly. Peer debriefing is something that we do on a daily, do regularly in research, right? Hawthorne effect or social desirability bias. I think it was Pire Sapna who had asked a question regarding that. Social desirability is the tendency of some respondents to report an answer in a way they deem to be more socially acceptable than would be their true answer. Okay. Sometimes people answer in a certain way that they expect that you are expecting them to answer. Okay. The presence of a researcher can affect the way that the respondents respond. How you can reduce that? You can reduce that by avoiding leading questions, ensuring our responses to what they're saying are neutral, by avoiding value-laden language, also by assuring them that this data is completely anonymous and it would not be used to harm them, creating that rapport with the respondent where they are able to trust you. That's very important in qualitative research. You might be asking them certain sensitive questions. You might be asking people about their identity. You might be asking them about certain psychological issues. Whenever you're asking respondents about those issues, you need to create a relationship of trust between them and yourself. So it's very important that the researcher make the interviewee very comfortable. How you can do that? You can assure them how the data will be used. So give them an ethics form, tell them about how strictly you follow those protocols, and tell them that you are only interested in their views, all right? And actually mean it. I was once translating interviews by someone, and she was doing a PhD in a very well-reputed international university. But the way that she had collected data, I was really impressed by her tactics. She every time she was collecting data after the 2010 floods in Badin and Thar, and she went to them and said, "I do not know this. Can you please explain this to me?" So she came from a position of from a very low position to those respondents. She told them that she doesn't know, and that sort of built a very good rapport with the respondents, and they were able to speak freely. So using some tactics to build a kind of relationship where the respondent is actually able to answer you without being affected by your presence. Obviously, qualitative research is very subjective, and there is going to be some impact of the researcher, but we try to minimize it as much as possible. All right, moving on, observations. Hopefully interviews are clear to everybody, and we'll take the questions at the end. Observations in social science research. I'll let you read the definition while I drink some water. So the key term here is gathering live data. So the main advantage of doing an observation is that you're able to go in that context and observe live data from the social situation rather than relying on secondhand accounts like in interviews or questionnaires. As they say, actions speak louder than words, right? Social desirability bias that we just talked about is more noticeable in interviews and surveys than in observations because you're observing people in their natural situations. Observations may take place in public or private. They could take place in a school class, a staff room, a playground, a university lecture. So it can happen in a number of settings. Let's try some examples. What disrupts pupils' concentration in science lessons? Would we ask teachers? Would we ask pupils? Look at test results? Observe? What would we do? I'll look for your answers in the comments. I don't see any responses related to this. Shafiq, do you see any responses? Since we're talking about pupils' concentration in a lesson, it might be much more effective to observe than to ask somebody or look at their results. Okay, let's take a look at the second one. Okay, so if you reply to this one, please write 2 and then reply so that I can see. There are way too many comments in somebody has written observe. Yes, you're right, Uzair. Thank you. Do disruptive pupils get more teacher attention than high achieving pupil? If you ask disruptive pupils, they're probably not going to be honest. If you ask high achieving pupils, that's also a case of honesty. Asking parents and teachers depends on whose parents you're asking. So observation is a good tool. Actions speak louder than words, so you observe them. Studying prohibited behavior like bullying, cheating in exams, smoking in schools. Would you do interviews, questionnaires, or observations? Yes, Hajra and Kiran. That's right, Pere. Amanullah says observation. That's right. Wafa, we'll take your question at the end. Yes, so we will use observations in this case as well, because interviews and questionnaires, people do not talk about prohibited behavior very easily. Observing them in that situation might help. However, it is going to be tricky to observe people while bullying or cheating or smoking, and you might need to do it covertly in a hidden manner rather than overt. Okay, types of observations, they're parallel with interview types, structured, unstructured, and semi-structured. Structured observations, participant observations first. So participant observations are usually unstructured. So what you do is you become a participant in the situation. So if it's a school, you go there, you become a teacher, you become a student, and you observe them from that standpoint. You try and look for interesting things naturally. So you don't have a schedule, you don't have any list of things that need to be observed. You observe very naturally what is going on and probably take notes. It's more common in anthropology, sociology, etc. Ethnographic research tends to use participant observation. Um, one of one of my one of my friend's supervisors was actually researching in some villages in India, and even though she was from the UK, she went and lived there in those villages for 3 months, did everything that the women there did, and that is how she collected her data. So anthropologists and sociologists tend to do their research that extensively, that intensively, actually. It can be covert, it can be hidden, but mostly overt in fields like education. In education, people don't tend to do hidden observations, right? You always tell the participants, it's ethically right to tell the participants that you're observing them. Then we have structured observations. It's usually collecting quantitative data. So you have an observation schedule, a paper on which you know what to observe in how much time. So you have time intervals written on that schedule, and you have those factors written which you need to observe. So it's very structured, very organized. You have regular observations with rules. So types of participant observation. We are going to focus on participant observation because that's the one that is qualitative in nature. There are different types of participant observations. There is complete participant. So you're already working as a teacher in a school. You start observing your class. You don't tell them, it's covert, it's hidden. Then participant as observer, you were already working as a teacher. You tell your colleagues or your students that you're now going to observe them. It's overt, it's open, you're not hiding it from them. Then you could be an observer as a participant. So you would join a school specifically to observe them. And you could be helping out as a teaching assistant or teach an occasional class, but your main job is to observe, and everybody there knows it. Complete observer may be something like you do not have any role there, but you just sit at the corner of the class observing them. There is some debate in academic, in methodological literature, that whether it's really possible to be a complete observer. If you're sitting in a class, you are a participant to some extent. You're affecting the setting to some extent. So it might not be possible to become a complete observer 100%, but to some extent, if you're not participating in the class activities, you are a complete observer. Moving on, strengths and challenges of participant observations. Let's take a look at the strengths first. It gives you rich data. That's an advantage of all qualitative research. Qualitative research gives you rich data. It gives you insights that are not available through other methods. Things people forget to talk about or take for granted. So it gives you insights that people might not say in an interview. There are things that we take for granted. We don't really think about saying them out, but a person observing will be able to take note of that. It gives you a fresh perspective. So you could think like, what would a Martian think? If somebody from Mars, an alien, came here and looked at it, what would they think? So that kind of perspective is given to you in observations. There are various challenges in participant observations. How do you become a participant? Like, how do you find a role? How do you build that trust with your participants? How do you get in, and then how do you get out? Right? So those things are very difficult. Maintaining the authenticity. There are going to be social desirability effect in an observation as well. Do you remember when you were in school, sometimes the DO used to visit or an inspection team used to come, like, and the whole school would be whitewashed and everybody's uniform would be checked and everything had to go properly. So if somebody is coming to observe, then people's behavior might change. And how you can remove that social desirability effect? Same way that I talked about earlier. You ensure a good reputation, good rapport with the participants. You assure them of your powerless situation, that you're not going to impact them in any way. You ensure them of anonymity and all the ethics being followed. Following ethics is very challenging in observation. So who do you take permission from? If you're observing a school playground, so do you take permission from each and every participant? Obviously, yes, you should. Going native, like becoming part of that situation, becoming a part of the organization that you're observing, that's also very tricky. All right. How can you collect data in participant observation? You can collect it through field notes, through interviews, photographs, recordings. Field notes are very difficult to keep if you're hiding your status as an observer. You will have to take field notes after the observation. So depending on your memory, what you have collected. Sampling decisions and observations might include cases. So what exactly are you observing? The observation sites such as schools, classrooms, villages, companies. You could sample that. You could sample informants. So if you're observing specific people, or you could sample time. You can think about how many visits to the site are necessary. Okay. Structured observation uses a fixed observation schedule that is created following a methodical guideline. If you want to learn more about how to create a structured observation schedule, which is quantitative observation, you can refer to RISV 2010. I have the complete reference in the reference list. It's more commonly used in psychology, linguistics, and often used in experimental studies or evaluation studies. Used where interested in frequency and classification of behavior rather than meaning. And it's more common in quantitative research and hence will not be discussed further here. Okay. All right. We're moving towards the end of the webinar. I will talk about validity and reliability in qualitative research. Now, these concepts are more common in quantitative research. They talk about replication and generalizability. So if this research were to be done again, would we get similar results? If this research is reliable, that means that it is generalizable. Now, these two domains of replication and generalizability are not acceptable in qualitative research. Qualitative is not the same in that way. We cannot generalize qualitative data. We cannot expect to replicate qualitative data as well. So what's to be done in qualitative research? The concepts have been defined differently. Long and Johnson define validity in terms of trustworthy, authentic, rich, and accurate data in qualitative research. Reliability means dependable, confirmable, and transferable results. Okay. So we talk about trustworthiness and dependability rather than reliability and validity. Okay. People often talk about validity and reliability in qualitative research as well. So it's not about the terminology, it's about the concept. It means something different in qualitative research. How do we ensure trustworthiness and dependability in qualitative research? You could take a certain steps. You could take steps like the first one is understanding of the context. So it can be based on personal experience, it can be based on literature review. You read and you ensure that your instruments are suitable for the chosen setting. You take all necessary steps to remove researcher bias. No leading questions. Don't give too much information about the topic. Check with a peer or supervisor. Make sure that your questions are neutral. Another step that you could take is piloting. It's very important to test your instruments for clarity and connection with your research question before collecting your main data. We always do a smaller study before our main study. That's our pilot. Peer debriefing. Lincoln and Guba say that peer debriefing is a very good element of checking dependability of our data. Check with a peer at data collection and at analysis level. Keep records and justify. Every step that you take in research should be justified with a reason. Everything that you do, you need to give a reason of that. These are my references. You could get into the details of each one of them and see that they would be useful for the different steps that we've talked about today. Thank you very much. Shafiq, we could take questions now.
All right. Okay, we can take one or two questions because we are really, have covered a lot of time. If I can show you, if you can see the questions on your screen, man.
Where can I see them? Comments. Okay, yes.
Okay. Okay, it's a comment, rather a question. Here there is a Sayyida Shirazi is asking, on one hand, you take consent for the interview, and on other hand, you hide your identity in ethnography. Isn't the dichotomy of qualitative? Sorry, yes, qualitative.
We do not usually. It's Kiran, I think. Kiran, we don't usually hide our identity in qualitative research. We at some points there is covert observation, but then there are certain factors behind it. So if you can only keep it covert if by telling your identity it would be harmful to you in some way, if it would affect your own security, only then you can keep it covert. Otherwise, ethical protocols require that you keep it overt and you keep it open. So you shouldn't usually keep your identity hidden.
Okay, so it has last one. Does becoming native for outsider not become a bit artificial? Will it affect the data?
Becoming native means that trying to mingle in that atmosphere. Becoming native means that you are becoming part of that atmosphere. So hopefully it would not become artificial if you're in an educational setting and you become a teacher while you're observing. That's not necessarily artificial. It would not affect your data.
All right, mate. Thank you so much, Dr. Ghazal Shaikh,
Thank
for the
you.
great presentation and for answering those questions. It was a pleasure to have you It was a pleasure to have you with us, and inshallah, we will be looking forward once again from you. So, thank you so much. So I hope everyone has enjoyed and learned from this session, and we will be having such type of webinar in future as well. So till then, take care, keep learning, keep shining. Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz. Thank you.